Hello, my fellow strawmen, and welcome back to the Fields of Hay. Today, I'm continuing my rebuttal of Made by Jimbob's playlist of arguments against atheism, so if you didn't catch my first video, go check that out. But if you're ready to keep going, we'll be starting with the one topic I actually agree with Jimbob on, the problem of evil. So to my fellow atheists, let's hear what Jimbob has to say, and then I'll explain why I agree that the problem of evil is not a compelling reason for me to think there is no triomni God.
So what is the argument from evil? I don't want to straw man it, so let's get it in precise form. The argument from evil goes as follows. Premise 1, God is omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent. Premise 2, an all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful God wouldn't permit suffering in the world. Premise 3, there is suffering in the world. Conclusion, God knows suffering will occur, so he either can't stop suffering, so he's not omnipotent, or he refuses to, so he's not omnibenevolent.
Very briefly, my solution to this problem is based on the wording in premise 2, that such a God wouldn't permit suffering. I think that knowing what God would or wouldn't permit assumes too much about their intentions and what they consider to be good. If the goal is to create a utopic eternal afterlife, then perhaps putting us through some mortal life filled with suffering is good, because it gives us the chance to make free will decisions by which we can be judged and potentially earn that utopia. Or something along those lines. I don't claim to speak to the particulars of thousands of different theologies. But at least on that point, I see no inconsistencies in the claim of God's existence.
Alrighty, did you see any obvious problems? I did. Premise 2 states an all-knowing, all-loving, and all-good God wouldn't permit suffering in the world.
See, we agree on something. It happens rarely enough, I think that's worth celebrating.
Well, why not? What's the contradiction? It seems this very low-level argument from personal incredulity has no basis. From a Christian view, long-suffering is actually a virtue. It is through suffering and sacrifice that we participate in the good. The overcoming of suffering is thematic in the Christian view and praxis.
I kind of agree with this point. I do think that good can come out of suffering. To be clear, I condemn anyone who intentionally causes suffering, but suffering will happen nonetheless. Life and nature are plenty capable all on their own of putting people into harsh situations. To me, part of growing as a person is learning to pick yourself back up when life kicks you down.
This premise also makes an assumption that suffering is evil. My question to the atheist is, what makes suffering evil?
I would say, from my humanistic perspective, that intentionally causing suffering to people is evil. But I wouldn't presume that if God exists, he must be a humanist like myself. After all, my humanism is deeply rooted in my own personal experience as a human. Really, all the problem of evil does for me is say that if an all-good, all-powerful God exists, then for whatever reason that God sees it as good to sometimes make us suffer. God isn't a humanist. I think the mistake a lot of atheists make with this argument is that while they're trying to do an internal critique of the Abrahamic faith, they use their own personal idea of what good is.
When the atheist says pain and suffering is bad, they are actually saying most people don't prefer to feel pain or suffering. Most people don't prefer the taste of licorice either.
Licorice.
If the atheist is claiming that we ought to pursue our preferences, then I'm not sure what was wrong with Jeffrey Dahmer eating brain custard. He merely preferred it to Ben and Jerry's.
This is why I was careful to say that, to me, evil is when suffering is caused with intent. It's not just about one person being in pain. That may be a tragedy, but not evil. Evil is about people interacting with each other, about one person knowingly, willfully causing another to suffer. Morality is only meaningful as part of our often unspoken social contract. And for most of us, it's worth it to follow because we find value in the society around us. My life is made much more comfortable by living in a civilized society with medical care and a stable food system and cheap transportation, compared to a world where I'm fending for myself just to survive. We are stronger together. So if I'm choosing between brownies and ice cream for dessert and I prefer one over the other, neither of those choices is harmful to those around me and I'm good to go with my heart. But if I'm Dahmer and I have to choose between ice cream and brains, and I really love brains, maybe I can realize the consequences of the fear and hatred my actions would inspire in those who find out I'm eating their loved one's brains. Even if, as Dahmer, I have no regard for the harm I'm causing to others, I can hopefully realize the risk to myself, and decide it's better in the long run to settle for the ice cream. And if that fails, that's what the police are for. I'm not waiting around for some god to protect me or give me some divine authority to punish Dahmer. All I need is an organized, well-funded group of people who are capable of defending their homes from people like Dahmer.
Now, for the sake of the argument, what if we grant the atheist that evil exists in the world?
I'd rather not be granted this, at least not in the sense of objective evil existing. I'm happy to say that things are subjectively evil and that morality is a social construct. But the problem of evil isn't about what positions are granted to the atheist. The problem of evil is an internal critique of the belief in the triune God, which does entail objective good. The problem of evil doesn't fail because atheists can't ground objective morality. It fails because it assumes too much about what the objective morality of a theistic worldview would judge as good or evil. From my subjective viewpoint, I don't have access to this objective standard of goodness, and so I can't say it's contradictory to the suffering we all agree exists. Now, I've spoken about this topic before, so if you want more of my opinion on it, I'll link the video I made on the problem of evil here. And while I'm willing to grant Jimbob that the problem of evil is not a good reason to disbelieve in theism, I'm sure he'll be disappointed to know that I'm still an atheist. My reason for disbelieving God is unrelated to the problem of evil, but getting into it now would be too much of a tangent. Instead, let's get back to the meat and potatoes of this video and explain why the last two arguments Jimbob has against atheism are on the same tier to me as the problem of evil is to him.
There are plenty of questions the atheist cannot answer, but this is the question of all questions. Why ought we pursue true beliefs as opposed to any belief that provides us utility?
As far as questions that are supposed to stump atheists go, this one's not very stumpy. I hope we're all familiar with Hume's is-ought problem. We cannot derive an ought from an is. We must base it in some accepted value. I think that one very general value that most people hold is that they want to be able to accomplish the goals they have in mind for their life. If I believe in falsehood, then the plans I lay to reach those goals won't correspond to reality and will likely fail. But if I understand reality correctly, then I am much more likely to accurately predict the outcome of my actions, make good judgments, and get to where I want to go. False beliefs may provide the utility of feeling good, but they rarely go beyond that. It's not without reason that religion has often been called the opium of the masses. But true beliefs can help your expectations of the future line up with what is actually going to happen, and it opens so many doors in terms of utility. To give a more direct example, something that most of us have some personal experience with, I understand that another of our shared values is that we don't like subjecting ourselves to pain. Maybe there are rare sadistic exceptions, but this is true for the vast majority of people. So imagine that you walk into a room with a hot stove and you don't care about the truth. You may believe that the stove isn't hot, and so what if that isn't the case, right? Well, a few minutes later, you want to rest your arm somewhere on the counter and the stove is just at the right height. Faithful that the stove is cool and that it won't burn you, and without reservation, you rest your full weight right on the burner. Jim Bob would like to know why it's better in this situation to hold true beliefs. The answer is really quite simple. It's so you don't burn yourself.
The common position I see among atheists is similar to this one from Apologia. He says, I care not about the utility of Christianity, only the truth of Christianity. Of course, when we ask them, why do you care about what's true, they will undoubtedly say it's because it's useful, which circles us back to utility.
I made this channel and named it as I did because it's stuff like this that I see so commonly amongst apologists, strawmanning atheist positions. They strawmanned me into existence, and now I'm here to haunt them. But jokes aside, the original wording of Jim Bob's question implies that he too accepts that we should hold useful beliefs. What he's missing in understanding about comments like Apologias, and what I hope I've made clear with my hot stove example, is that true beliefs simply have a much better chance at being useful than false ones. Neither of us think Christianity is true, and so we find no value in its promises, no matter how useful they seem to others. On a slightly tangential note, it is strange to me that in Jim Bob's attempt to defend Christianity, he implies that without assuming that God exists, he can't seem to find a reason to care about whether his beliefs are true. It makes me put very little weight on any conclusions he draws about the truth that God exists.
Under their view, Christianity and other religions are false beliefs, but as long as they're useful, the atheist really has no leg to stand on in arguing against holding them as true, even if they were false.
But as long as they're false beliefs, they are inherently less useful than whatever belief is true. I don't see why this is so difficult. This should be something we can agree on independently of which thing is actually true. Whether God exists or not, true beliefs are more useful than false ones. That's why I have no problem with saying that if some religion out there is correct and God does exist, then I'd like to discover them and be convinced of their beliefs. I would happily renounce my atheism if I found it to be untrue. Why can't Jim Bob do the same? It is such a massive red flag to me that he has to first decide it's true that God exists and then conclude that truth matters. If Jim Bob were honest, he'd admit that if atheism were true, then he would like to be convinced of it and eventually renounce his false God.
And if the atheist is honest, they would admit to holding their own false beliefs for the sake of utility. For example, human rights.
Okay, but I don't see human rights as a truth claim about the universe. They're subjective opinions. As part of my selfish altruism, I think that my life will be better if society in general is bettered, and I think that treating people respectfully and with basic decency is helpful towards that end. So while I think that we ought act in a way that is influenced by accepting the concept of human rights, Those rights only exist, so to speak, as long as the people across society accept that concept. By the way, if some cultural Christian wants to live their life by the teachings of Christ, even if they don't think he literally existed and was the Son of God, that's fine. My objection is when Christians expect other people to agree with their conclusions, when those conclusions are founded on the literal acceptance of the supernatural, which we don't believe to be true. So for me to say that I find value in the teaching of human rights, but I don't claim that they are literal truths about the universe, and I reject the idea of forcing people to agree with me, then there's no hypocrisy to my holding the belief. It's the exact same standard I would expect of anyone else.
An honest atheist will admit that human rights are as fictional as angels under their view, and yet they hold that human rights exist everywhere there is a human. They demand empirical evidence for miracles and other things, and yet they scream about human rights violations.
I do believe human rights and angels are both entirely fictional, both just part of the cultural story we immerse ourselves in to help us find our values. If someone finds the concepts of angels morally inspirational, all power to them. I hope they can do the same for me. But I make no claim as to the literal truth of human rights, only their social value. I'm constantly worried about the rights being violated because they don't really exist, and they can just be ignored by people who don't care for them. If we want to punish those who violate human rights, we have to stand up and do it ourselves. On the other hand, when people claim I should put my faith in angels to take care of me, that possibility depends on the literal existence of said angels. Is it really so inconsistent for me to ask for evidence of them? And speaking of evidence for miracles, Jimbob's final argument is for one miracle he thinks there is evidence of that even atheists can't deny. Let's hear it.
You know how atheists say, I see no evidence for miracles?
Which is something I do say, so let's be clear about what I mean when I say miracles and what standard of evidence I'm looking for. A miracle is something contradictory to natural explanations, or something inexplicable by natural mechanisms. Not something we don't understand, not something which confuses and baffles people, but something which actively goes against the most foundational truths we hold. Things like the laws of logic, probability, and thermodynamics. If you showed me a dead and decayed person whose brain unrotted and they came back to life, that'd do it for me. Or if you take a large bag of Skittles and sort it by shaking it, more on that in my video linked here, that'd also meet the standard to me. I certainly have no direct experience with either, and only rumors and hearsay of the former.
What is a miracle under the atheist view? I've defined it as the following. A miracle is an event or phenomenon that cannot be explained by the laws of physics. This is not referring to an event we have not yet explained by the laws of physics. It's an event or phenomenon that definitionally cannot be explained by the laws of physics.
I'm fine with this definition. As long as what I'm saying about the miraculous event being inherently contradictory to the laws of nature is the same thing as what Jimbob means about being definitionally unexplainable, then I think we're on the same page. We're not just looking for something where my personal knowledge of physics can explain something, because I'm just a dumb human with a finite experience who can't be expected to know everything. We're looking for something categorically unexplainable by unintentional natural means, something only explainable by an intelligent intervener. Such a miracle would certainly make good evidence for the existence of an intelligence beyond our own.
Is there anything under the atheist view that cannot be explained by the laws of physics? Let's see, how about lightning? Nope, we can explain that. How about the venom production in a platypus?
Oh, it's so cute. Ah!
Nope, we can explain that. It seems like anything we point to in the natural world can be or could eventually be explained by the laws of physics. So, is there anything we can point to that can't be explained by the laws of physics? What about the existence of the laws of physics themselves? Can the laws of physics and the regularity of nature explain their own existence? I don't think so.
Bear with me for a moment, but what if we made up the idea of an atheistic miracle, something which was inherently unexplainable under a theistic worldview? It'd be an exactly parallel definition, except that instead of being unexplainable under natural means, it'd be unexplainable under God. Imagine if I run through the options and I see that trees can be accounted for by theists, so can morality, so can all the other things. And I can't seem to find any atheistic miracles. Except, wait, if you think about it, what about, can God explain God's own existence? I don't think so. I hope that strikes you as a dishonest conclusion, because it is. It's just as dishonest as the loophole Jimbob tries to point out about the inconsistency of naturalism. Now, while I do think that taking a mirror position is a wonderful exercise to get an intuition of whether an argument is any good, I'd still like to give a direct answer as to why this one isn't. To really explain what explains the laws of physics, let's start by what I understand the laws of physics to be. And if you want more detail, I made a video on that topic, I'll link here. Boy, I'm just quoting all my previous videos today. But in summary, my view is that physics, like math, is a described thing. It's a description of the patterns of consistency we find in nature. So the laws of physics are explained by the uniformity of nature. But I also recognize this is just kicking the can down the line and brings up a natural question. What explains the uniformity of nature? To which I say that I think it's a fundamental fact, something which just can't not be true. It is ultimately a similar answer to what I hear from theists. At some point, when we trace causality back in time, we both run into this dichotomy of there either being an uncaused starting point or something which existed eternally into the past. The way I view nature as being uncaused is very similar, perhaps identical to the way that many theists think that God is uncaused. And neither of us should point to this unintuitive, uncaused nature of the fundamental truths in each other's worldview as something which disproves that worldview. When I make my argument about why I think God doesn't exist, it isn't that a being is uncaused that bothers me. It's that I don't think such uncausedness is compatible with the complexity inherent in an all-knowing, maximally wise mind. It's the same line of reasoning that makes me think that jumbo jets can't be formed out of tornadoes randomly blowing bits together, that amoebas couldn't be formed directly out of the primordial soup, and that bags of Skittles can't be sorted by shaking them. An intelligence is a far more complex thing than any of those, and so I reject solipsism and I reject God. Sorry for the small tangent, but to get back to the main point, I don't know the metaphysics underlying physics. I accept that they're there, but I don't really understand them. That does not rise to the level that we agreed to call a miracle. I'm looking for a contradiction to physics, not some loophole. Remember when I said that I was fine with Jimbob's definition as long as the phrase cannot be explained as pointing to a contradiction, not merely a lack of understanding? Does Jimbob really think the laws of physics are contradictory to the laws of physics? He's getting caught up in this confusion of what the terminology we're using means and losing sight of the real goalposts.
Premise 1. A miracle is an event or phenomenon that cannot be explained by the laws of physics. Premise 2. The laws of physics and the regularity of nature cannot explain their existence. Conclusion. The existence of the laws of physics and regularity in nature is a miracle under the atheist view.
As far as the syllogism goes, I'll say that the truth of premise 1 assumes the laws of physics to be a valid rule by which to judge something's veracity. At this point in our understanding of nature, they aren't in need of an explanation. They're assumed true. Thus, the second premise is irrelevant.
Now, what are the responses we can expect from the atheists? One might be, well, just because we haven't yet explained how we have those laws doesn't mean we won't eventually discover an answer.
I agree with the sentiment of this potential response, but I don't like the wording. I don't think there's an answer that could be waiting out there that would help us to use the laws of physics to explain the laws of physics. Maybe there's an answer out there in metaphysics, but not physics. And even if we find those answers, it's just kicking the can down the line. At some point, as far as I'm concerned, the patterns of reality we describe as the laws of nature just are.
Well, the reason this isn't a valid counter to the argument is because any causal chain you posit would be bound by the same laws. To say a previous set of laws of physics produced the current laws of physics is to assume a process that adheres to the laws of physics, which is also producing those laws while abiding by them.
Which is why I take the existence of the laws of nature, or rather whatever properties nature has, which we use the laws of nature to describe, as part of the necessary being of the universe. If there is something underlying the causality of their existence, it's something esoteric and metaphysical and far beyond my understanding. And without that understanding, it simply isn't a miracle. It isn't something we know to contradict an atheistic or naturalistic worldview.
Another counter could be, I reject your definition of a miracle.
No, I had no real problems with the definition. My problem was that instead of finding something within reality which didn't fit the pattern of the rest of reality, Jimbob just went for a technicality that doesn't strike me as an honest attempt to demonstrate a miracle. If we consider Jimbob's question with the nearly synonymous wording I had in mind for the definition of a miracle, it becomes clear that the answer is more about clever loopholes in the meanings of words than an actual deep metaphysical understanding of why the laws of physics couldn't exist without an intervening intelligence. So to summarize the arguments Jimbob put forward today, he thinks that atheists must hold nature itself to be miraculous. But I'm not interested in wordplay, and I see no reason to think that nature is somehow in contradiction with itself, so this falls flat. He also thinks that even if atheism were true, there'd be no reason to care about that truth and actually believe in atheism. But I think that holding true beliefs is better in the long run, so he's welcome to keep any knowingly false beliefs to himself. But if I ever convince him of atheism's truth, I hope he doesn't hold on to what he knows to be false and comes over to the greener grass on this other side. There's a lot of good places to lay down, relax, and just read a fucking book.